I fly up from Dallas, Texas, just to let you all know that yesterday, Dallas, it was like, about 50 degrees, not hot, but, slightly cool. But I knew it was coming to Chicago, so I got my heavy coat and got in the car and drove to the airport. So I got out and I was running a little bit late, so I grabbed my stuff, was getting in line and going through the security line and getting ready to go through the security gates, and I heard someone say, "Now be sure to put your coats in the bins." And I thought, my coat's in my car. So when you see someone without a coat walking around this cool Chicago weather, that's me. Because I left my coat back in Dallas-Fort Worth, where I'll really need it when I get back there and it's 60 degrees. So thank you for welcoming me to Chicago. I want to talk about racial issues, obviously, and I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I am a Christian and I'm a scholar, and for me, they go together. I believe that good scholarship, good theology go together. Science tells us truth. Our theology tells us truth. Truth is truth. When science and theology disagree, you either have bad science, or you have bad theology, or worst of all worlds, you have bad both. So I'm going to present to you, I'm going to talk to you about what I see as a Christian approach towards racial issues and how we're to deal with racism. I argue it's backed by research, and I'm going to discuss some of that research with you. I'm also going to bring in some Bible verses, discuss some theology. I'm a little nervous about that because I'm here in front of a bunch of theologians and pastors. So I'm going to agree with you. You don't critique my theology. I won't critique your sociology because some of y'all use that in your sermons, and some of y'all don't know what you're talking about. I have to say, some of the way y'all describe society, it's missed the mark a little bit. But that's going to be my approach towards how I want to do this afternoon. My argument is that our Christian faith should inform us about something like racism, because racism is an ethical issue. And what's happened in our society is we've tried to approach it. I'm talking about two different approaches that are based in secular foundations, not a Christian foundation. In a Christian foundation, we'd be doing something different, and I'm going to implore you to do something different than what we have been doing. And as they say, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. And if we keep doing what we have been doing, we're going to get the same result we have, which I think most of us agree is not a result we want concerning racial issues here in this country. So that's a little bit of introduction onto what I want to do and how I want to approach this topic. Can Christianity teach us anything unique about racism? With that, let's get started. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. We live in a racialized society. Yes, hello? Oh, good. Yes. We live in a racialized society. That's a society where race matters profoundly in life opportunities, our life experiences, our social relationships. In other words, race matters. Because I am an African American man, it has helped to shape what I experience in this world. Is it the only thing? No. Is it the most important thing? No. But does it shape my experiences? Yes. Just to give a little fun example, when I was younger, I used to play basketball. My knees retired me. My knees said, "You're not playing basketball any longer." I said, "I follow you, oh knees." When I walked on the basketball court, I knew that I was more likely to be picked for a team because I was black. Because blacks are better basketball players, right? I knew that. So that's affected my life experience. If I'm driving and a police officer pulls me over, I'm not saying the police officer pulls me over because I am black, but that enters into the interaction, does it not? My social relationships, people will treat me differently because of my race. My life experience, my opportunities. It may give me more opportunities, such as on a basketball court. It may give me less opportunities in other ways. These things are affected by race. So all this is saying is race matters. It impacts us, it matters. And that's the society we live in. How does it matter? So we need to look at the context of how it matters. So I think these first two statements are not controversial. First statement, marginalized racial groups have endured centuries of racial abuse in the United States. Is there any doubt to that effect? Do we need to go ahead and read about what Jim Crow was, much less slavery? Do we need to read about the internment centers, the Japanese that were forced into? Do we need to read what's happened to the Latino workers on farms? Do we need to read what happened to Native Americans? Do we really need to be convinced that there's been centuries of what can be called at least racial abuse, if not worse, in our society? There's no doubt about that. Second statement, overt laws and rules supporting such abuse have been eliminated. Now, we can talk about racism and we can define institutional racism and structural racism, and that's all well and good, and I'm willing to have that talk. But overt racism, we don't have laws of Jim Crow today, thank God. We don't force Native Americans onto reservations today, thank God. Overt laws, overt rules have been eliminated. And in fact, the worst thing you could be called in this society that is legal, that you could be legally this and you could be called this, is a racist. Anything worse is illegal. So calling someone a child molester is worse than calling them a rapist. If I know you're a child molester, I have evidence you're a child molester, you know what my next phone call is to? The police. Because that's against the law, and I want the police to come investigate that. If I know, have evidence you're a racist, what's my next phone call to? My wife to complain about you. But I'm not calling the police, because that is legal. But that's the worst thing you could be called, that's legal, right? If you're known as a racist, that impacts your life in this society negatively. We don't have this sort of overt laws, rules, overt types. I'm not saying we don't have overt racists, because those people still exist, but we don't have the laws. It's not legal in our society today. Those two statements should not be controversial. Now, what do we do? How do we handle that? That's where we get controversial. Two main approaches in which we've tried to handle dealing with this. Next slide, please. First approach is that racism is overt and done from one person to another. And it's an overt type of racism. So it's not, there's no, maybe that person was racist or not. No, it is overt racism. Someone's mistreating someone based on their race. Saying, I don't like you because of you're a whatever. Overt racism. People who conceptualize racism like this, the way to deal with racism is a concept that scholars have talked about, and the concept is known as colorblindness. And the basic idea behind colorblindness is, I am going to not treat you any differently because of your race. In essence, I am going to ignore your race and treat you like I treat anyone else. And if we do that, then we don't have racism because it's about overt racism that I treat you differently because of your race. If we woke up, everyone in the world, or at least the United States, woke up and they were, a bright shade of red. First thing we would go is, that's not attractive. The second thing is people go, okay, well, there's no more race, right? We're all the same race. We can't tell the difference between one another. Wouldn't this not be what we want? This is not the goal we have in dealing with racial issues. And that's where this perspective of colorblindness comes from. So that's one way to deal with this reality of centuries of racial abuse, but no overt racism, therefore let's just ignore race. Second way, though, is racism is structural as well as individualistic. And social institutions can perpetuate racism even when individuals do not intend to be racist. So it's not about whether or not I particularly don't like people of different race. If I live in a structure, an institution created by those who benefited from those institutions and impact people negatively, people of color, marginalized groups negatively, we have to deal with that as well. Now, when I was writing about this sort of approach in my 2006 book, I believe, Beyond Racial Gridlock. Oh, by the way, the cards passed out is my forthcoming book, Beyond Racial Division. This talk is situated in that book. In fact, the book goes more in depth into it. And so if you enjoy this talk and you like it, please pre-order the book. If you don't like the talk and you say this, what he has, I don't want, it makes for a nice little paper airplane that you can fold and throw around. So that's little plug there for the book. All right. So if this is the solution, then we have to be very proactive in dealing with racism. We have to engage in it. In the 2006 book, I call this approach white responsibility. The whites are responsible, and thus we have to deal with the mess they've made. It actually was a tamer title. My original, when I went to the publisher, I said, hey, let's call this Whites Are Evil. They said, down boy. Let's find something a little bit more palatable, so we went with white responsibility. But that didn't take hold. And today, I think the term that really has captured it is a term that you all have heard of called anti-racism. And I'm pretty sure you've heard of it because you all are educated people, and you probably know about a year and a half ago, the two most popular books on Amazon, New York Times bestseller list, were two books that featured anti-racism. The most popular one, more than the other one, was White Fragility by D'Angelo. But then behind it was How to Be Anti-Racist by Kendi. So there's so you had that. There's a lot of anti-racism programs. There's a lot of discussion on how we can do anti-racism. Very easy to find. It's out there. I'm going to talk about anti-racism. It has this sort of approach on how we're going to deal with structural, institutional, racial issues. My argument is both these models fail. Both these models are based in a secular ideology. And because of that, they cannot solve the problems of racism in our society. So let's look at them one at a time and why I argue they fail. First, let's look at colorblindness. Is it viable? All right, colorblindness is the notion that, all right, we've conquered racism, so the only thing to do is to accept our victory, ignore racial differences, and treat everyone the same. Colorblindness is viable if we have a fair society racially. If society is fair racially, then it makes sense to sort of ignore the differences and just live our lives. But what if it's not fair racially? What if there's racial wounds that have not healed, and we continue to see people of color not treated as fairly as whites? Then ignoring the wound will only make the wound worse. Because we know that wounds do not heal from ignoring them. They heal when we try to do something to treat them. The question is our society fair? Now, there is a ton of literature on this topic. I'm going to show you 4 studies. We could spend the next hour, if I had spent the time doing it, putting study after study up there, and I can discuss them and talk to you about this. But for sake of time, I'm only going to show you 4 studies that follow the path of what a lot of studies say, which is our society is not fair. First study. This first study is by researchers who do what we call a meta-analysis. Now that's when you take a lot of studies and you look through all of them and see what their patterns. And they looked at these studies over the past 25 years. And here's what they found. These studies were what we call audit studies. An audit study is when you take a white person and a black or Hispanic person, sometimes both, they apply for a job, and I won't get into all the weeds of the methodologies because there's certain things you have to do to make sure that you're doing this right. But you level out their resumes, you make them fairly equal, and you apply for jobs. And if you do it right, you can kind of tell whether or not the difference of a white person apply for a job shapes how they're treated from a black or Hispanic person. And one way I found out is that when a white person applies for a job, they're more likely to be called back for the interview than a black or Hispanic person. But here's the disturbing part. This tendency has not decreased over the past 25 years. So it's not that, there's a slight tendency, but it used to be really bad. No, it's the same as it has been for the past 25 years. We've not made progress on hiring discrimination when it comes to the callbacks for the past 25 years. So if you're an African American and you're Hispanic and you signal that on your job application, you're going to be less likely to be called back for the job. We would say that's not fair. Here's another study, driving while black. You may have heard this term. It's when African Americans are more likely to be pulled over than European Americans. Harris looked at this in Ohio. Other research has looked at other states. I think North Carolina's a state that's been looked at. We find evidence of driving while black, that blacks are more likely to be pulled over than whites. Now, one question you have to ask is, do blacks drive worse than whites? Maybe we deserve to be pulled over more. So they actually looked at driving patterns, and I have bad news. We drive as badly as you white people do. Yes, we speed, but so do you. So there's not enough difference in driving patterns to justify the level by which African Americans are pulled over. Why is that important? Because maybe it's just an inconvenience. You know, a little ticket, it's not the end of the world, right? This ties into literature and the criminal justice system. And here's what we know. That if you're African American and Hispanic, all other things being equal, you're more likely to be arrested. All other things being equal, if arrested, you're more likely to be charged with a crime. You're more likely to be put to a trial, all other things being equal, if you're charged. If put to a trial, all other things being equal, you're more likely to be found guilty. And all other things being equal, you're found guilty, you're more likely to serve a heavier sentence. This is reflective of a criminal justice system that is not equal, not fair. Here's another one. Residential segregation. So we have residential segregation in our societies. I come from Dallas-Fort Worth. I can tell you there's a black area of town, there's a Hispanic area of town. We're in Chicago. Chicago's famous for being a heavily segregated city. Now, you all come from all over the country, so maybe you come from a city or an area where that's not segregated. You would be the exception, not the rule. And what we know about segregation, as seen in this study, is that that segregation is tied to educational outcomes. So I'll use my experience to show what we mean by this. So I went to high school in Amarillo, Texas. I actually did not go to the black high school for reasons I won't go into. I wound up going to the Hispanic high school. Amarillo had 4 high schools at the time, now it has 5. 2 of those high schools were predominantly white. Those high schools, when I went off to college, they're the ones sending kids to college. The high school I went to, very few of my peers went to college with me. Why? As the mostly Hispanic high school, they tended to focus not on preparing kids for college, but on the industrial arts, on teaching kids how to build homes. So they got a different type of education than the kids were going to the better high schools. That is the problem. We have segregation. Black area town means black schools, and black schools or Hispanic schools don't prepare kids for success the way the white schools tend to. That's not fair. Here's one. Evidence of racism in healthcare practitioners, providers, by practice, by attitudes. So sometimes it's practice, sometimes it's what they prescribe. Sometimes their attitudes towards people of color is one of denigrating. These people looked at 39 different studies and they found evidence of this in 27 studies in 26 of those studies. So consistently, studies have found this evidence. You want to know why African Americans and Hispanic Americans are less likely to get the COVID shot? Their experience with healthcare is encountering racism. So society is not fair. For us to ignore race, to pretend racism doesn't exist, means that that wound goes on. And we talk to people of color and say, let's just ignore race, and yet we have these experiences. Naturally, we're suspicious about claims of colorblindness. Well, if colorblindness does not work, what about anti-racism? Because there you are willing to address some of these issues. So let's look at that. Let's define it first. Next slide, please. Now, what I wanted to do when I was writing this book is to have an understanding of anti-racism that wasn't just shaped by academic literature. So I read how to be an anti-racist, I read White Fragility. I read some other pretty popular anti-racism books, such as Me and White Supremacy. So You Want to Talk About Race, things of that nature. And I found certain patterns, and those patterns told me what people are learning from these books. For example, anti-racism is very proactive in its approach. The idea is we do not wait for evidence of racism, we seek it out and confront it immediately. The evidence we saw in that research on colorblindness, anti-racists would have said, okay, we have the problem in the criminal justice system, we have problems with our educational system, we need to go and take care of that. We don't need to wait around and hope that things turn out okay. The anti-racism books not only focus on being proactive, but they also focus on the unfairness there was from whites having advantages and privileges in our society. The books talked a lot about the advantages whites had in our society and privilege, and trying to confront these and trying to overturn them to create a fair situation. And you can see this throughout these, that was a common thread in these books. These books talked about taking action to dismantle those advantages, dismantle those privileges. So being proactive and confronting racism, not just in the individual, but in the structural, and in different institutions. So to dismantle it. There's also talk about what they call ending whiteness. And I want to clarify that because some people think ending whiteness was a call for genocide or something like that. It is not. But the way they would define whiteness was structures and norms and patterns that work to the advantage of whites, that whites tend to have these values and they work towards their advantage in our society. And so this is part of what they call ending whiteness in the book. And that was a common theme that I found in most, if not all of the books that I read. And finally, there was a focus on listening to people of color rather than taking over. And this was told to whites. Now, whites need to listen to people of color and not take the lead and let people of color take the lead and not take over. And in fact, I think it's fair to say that the role of whites, according to people in this book, is to listen to people of color and do what people of color want them to do. And that, I think, is and the way it is framed, different from book to book, but that theme came out again and again. I couldn't get away from that theme as I read these books. So these are the ideas of anti-racism, how we're going to be very proactive in dealing with these institutional problems. Now, the question I ask as a scholar is, okay, does it work? Because if it works, okay, maybe we need to do that. If it doesn't work, then maybe something's off. So let's look at some research. Okay, good, it's already up there. First thing, one of the things that they feel is necessary is to teach whites through diversity training on what they should do and how to reduce prejudice. But here's the problem. A meta-analysis by Lay et al. Shows that diversity training has very little long-term effects on prejudice. What will happen is you do diversity training, and right after the training, you'll see a drop in prejudice. And then you do another survey 6 months later, and it's gone back to where it was pre-training. It's kind of like when your kids goes off to Bible camp and comes back, they're on fire for the Lord, and they clean their room, and they say yes ma'am and no ma'am. And then 6 months later, the room's a mess. They're going, oh man, and it's gone back to normal. Everything's gone back to normal. I don't know this yet because my oldest is 6, but this is what I'm told is that they come back and they're on fire, and then 6 months later they're back, and that's diversity training. People have an effect, but it disappears. It doesn't have a lasting effect. But here's a problem. I mean, if that was all, then okay, maybe we get a little bit of something. But here's the problem. Diversity training can generate backlash against people of color. There are studies that show that when you do diversity training, it may not be every single time, but a lot of times, whites will go into diversity training and they'll leave and they'll actually have more hostile attitudes towards people of color. It's almost like, well, you forced me to do this, so now I'm really not going to like you. There's other research, I've not put this up to here, there's other research that shows that when you put diversity training for a company, that is a signal to majority group members that you've solved the racial problem, so they don't want to do anything else. Has diversity training? Okay, we're good now. Here's an interesting study talking about privilege. So these researchers looked at this effort to teach about privilege. And what they were expecting to find is that you teach about white privilege and people become more sympathetic to people of color because they realize the advantages whites have had in society. That didn't happen. They talk about white privilege and people's attitudes towards people of color did not change. What did change was their attitude towards marginalized whites. Whites who are homeless or suffering from substance abuse or mental health. What happened was that they became less sympathetic to marginalized whites. It was almost as if they were saying, well, you all have this privilege, so why are you having these problems? So this study indicates that teaching about white privilege, the overall effect is to create less sympathy for marginalized people. Doesn't change sympathy for people of color, reduces it for marginalized whites. Once again, the way we approach things could actually have detrimental effects. And then if we needed a nail in the coffin, this last study I think is it, because I think it's a fascinating study. Dobbins et al. What they did is they went to a bunch of mid-sized to large companies, and they looked at what they were doing to increase hiring managers of color, not just frontline workers, but people who be in charge of things. We want to diversify. So they looked at what they were doing, and they came back 5 years later. And they asked a question, a simple question, do you have more managers of color? And what they found was that those that engaged in what we would probably call anti-racism techniques actually had fewer managers of color 5 years later. So, for example, mandatory diversity training. Those that said, this we're going to have these diversity trainings so people will be more sensitive to people of color. 5 years later, you have fewer managers of color. We're going to have grievance committees so that people of color, when things go wrong, they can get their grievances heard. Fine. 5 years later, you have fewer managers of color. Who increased having managers of color? People who actually went to the managers there, mostly white, and said, help us recruit, mentor, and hire managers of color. Help lead our diversity teams. Going to those whites and working with them rather than dictating to them actually resulted in more managers of color being hired. And there's other studies, but anti-racism, it's something that I think people don't really realize is that most scholars understand diversity programs, anti-racism programs have not been effective. I don't know how many of y'all have read some of these anti-racism books. Read the books. Now, maybe I look for this because I'm a social scientist. They don't cite studies, hey, you do this, you get this outcome. And while it's not been called anti-racism, these sort of approaches have been done for decades now. And if we have positive outcomes, there'll be studies on this. The people doing these studies are not wearing MAGA hats. These people are pretty progressive. They would like to see these studies successful. The fact that they can't document that says a lot. So anti-racism doesn't work. So what are we going to do here? Well, before I get into that, I want to give us some context. Go to the next slide, please. Now, I'm not going to talk about critical race theory, so you can go, good. But I want to use this because whatever you want to think about critical race theory, it's useful as a placeholder for certain racial attitudes. Whether people understand it or not is almost less important than this placeholder effect. So this survey tells us something, all right? So 2021 survey, 19% of people strongly agree with critical race theory. The sort of racial attitudes that people who support critical race theory is going to be more like anti-racism, right? I think I'm being recorded, so I want to be very clear about that. I'm not saying anti-racism equals critical race theory. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that people who support critical race theory tend to support anti-racism. So about 20% of the country then supports anti-racism very strongly. 24% strongly disagree with critical race theory. Now, when we look at the reasons why people tend to disagree with critical race theory, it usually is through colorblind approaches. That whites are being mistreated and we're not treating people equally, we're not creating unity. I've read the people arguing why they oppose critical race theory. So, as a placeholder, I'm estimating approximately about 24%, 25% of the country is probably strongly aligned with colorblindness. Now, why did I put this up here? There's 45% of the country that is, maybe leans one way or another, but is not really feeling strongly, doesn't know, doesn't care, or is in the middle and just, they have problems. I have people come up to me and say, you know what? I see colorblindness doesn't work. We can't ignore race, but anti-racism is not working either. What am I supposed to do? The majority of the country is not strongly wedded to one camp or the other. Why don't we see this? Who gets the megaphones? Who gets on the shows? I don't care whether you're a Fox, MSNBC, CNN, whatever. Those people who get on the shows are not very nuanced. That's why we have this impression that everyone in the country is either anti-racism or colorblindness, and that's not the case. 55%, maybe 60% of the country is in the middle. They're gettable. We can outnumber them, but we have to have something to outnumber them with. We have to present them with something. And now I want to talk about what we can present them with. What's wrong with both of these problems? Next slide, please. Here's the truth both approaches lack, and that's human depravity. Now, you may say, well, that's not true. Anti-racists recognize how depraved whites are. That's fine. They do a great job of that. The principle of human depravity, though, is we're all depraved. It's not just one group that's depraved. We all struggle with that. So here comes some theology, so be gentle with me. I think this is the core of what Christianity is about. Because if we're not depraved, why do we need Christ? If my act is together and I got it all going on, why do I need to go to Christ? I got it all going on. Why did he have to come and die to save me if I got it all going on? God wastes his time. I got it all going on. But we don't have it together. None of us. All groups. We're selfish. We look for our self-interest. We have confirmation bias. All of us have that problem. And so you're asking me to solve the rest of your problems. I'm going to come with a solution that's going to meet my needs and my group's needs. And you're going to do the same thing. I may hedge it a little bit, but that's basically what's going to happen. And my group may not even be racial. I think a lot of whites who are down with the cause. In fact, I'm studying that a little right now. But they have certain political, cultural motivations that's coming out as well. We have this depravity. If we don't take that into consideration, we cannot solve racial problems in our country. Okay, next slide, please. I promised you Bible, I gave you Bible. Here's some scriptural backing for human depravity. To me, this is a core concept within our Christian faith. And there's a lot of verses. I only put 4 up there. Two from the Old Testament, 2 from the New Testament, because I think this is a common theme. The children of Israel are depraved, but the people around them are depraved too. The Bible doesn't ever say, these people, they are even God's people constantly show depravity. In our church, we constantly show depravity. We sanctify, we get better, but we still have that depravity. We're fighting. So this is a common theme in the Bible. And so we can find verses that shows this. And this is a key critical difference. What makes Christianity different from secular ideologies? Maybe not as much from other religions, but secular ideologies. And I'm going to suggest this is the key. Now you can say, well, secular ideologies, they don't believe in God. Well, some secularists do believe in a God. They believe in a different type of God, but they believe in a God. But the nature of humans is one of the key differences. And once we understand that opens a whole new world of understanding what we have to offer. Next slide, please. When I was in grad school, I learned about the ideals of human perfectibility. This came out in the Enlightenment movement, and it was in combat to the church, and it was this notion that humans are perfectible. Humans have the ability, they have the wherewithal to create something close to a paradise if we do the right things. Our abilities, we evolve to the state. This is the nature of humans according to those who are kind of a more secular type of ideology, that humans are perfectible. Let's see what that looks like. First, humans will become better with education. Why do we have these problems? People are uneducated. They've not recognized the problems that are there, the weaknesses that are there. So humans become better if we educate them the right way, if they learn the right things to do, and they'll become better. Well, what if humans, they don't take the education, they're irrational? Humans are rational. Creatures who become convinced to become better. Now, when I was learning this in grad school, I was not married, much less having any kids. I now today have a 6, 5, and 3-year-old. So today, if I hear that, I was like, are you crazy? Have you raised any kids? You know, my 3-year-old's a three-ager right now, so literally. So my 6-year-old is finally becoming a little bit rational. It's taking a lot of work, folks. You all know that. But are humans rational? Are humans rational creatures that if we present them these values, these ideals, and these goals, and people go, yeah, and they will move into it? Okay, well that's a big question. That's a big question and the secularists, the humanists argue, yes, we are. We just got to present to them, educate people, and then they will move to the direction that we need to be. Here's an example that you all may or may not think, depending on how much you've read about, on what this would look like. When you understand Marxism, you know, more than just the superficial, you understand what Marx was talking about was, you know, there's a false consciousness, we've been fooled, but if we can educate people to the reality and change our economic system, the economic system is not just about whether or not you get paid or not. Marx believes changing the economic system changes everything in society. And so neo-Marxists talk about, if we change the economic system, create this superstructure, we'll end not just poverty, but racism and xenophobia and all these issues. We just got to educate people, and they'll see rationally that this is the better course, and then we're going to head in that direction. You know, we're going to head towards that revolution that's going to make things, it's going to create this sort of paradise that's there. Now, other individuals, other people with the secular ideology may use different philosophies, but that's the direction that they're going. What does it have to do with race? Well, now we can start seeing why these approaches are more secular than they are Christian. If our insight, whether it is anti-racism or colorblindness, even though they have different conclusions, whether it's anti-racism or colorblindness, if our insight is adopted, we can move towards the end of racial alienation. So the goal then for the anti-racists is to convince people, adopt our philosophy, and when people adopt our philosophy, then we will end the problems of racial alienation. Adopt it. Same thing for colorblindness. I think we see it easier with anti-racism because it's so proactive, but it's true with colorblindness as well. A little more than a year ago, we're starting to talk to our 5-year-old about what race is. And so I got on Facebook, that wealth of knowledge, but I actually did want to talk to people who are raising kids of color and want to know, how do you approach the subject and talk about racial issues with your kids to create a healthy outcome? And I sometimes post things on Facebook that are slightly controversial, and I start to get blowback. I wasn't looking for blowback there. I was just looking for having a conversation, but I got some blowback. Blowback by people who said, why are you talking about race to your boys? Don't worry about raising them as good black men. Make them good Christian men, and that's all you have to worry about. You talking about race and bringing that in there, that's what's creating the problem of racial conflict. So it's sort of, I was quasi-amazed. Here I am, a race scholar, raising 3 black kids, and mostly white people are telling me, don't talk about race with them. Why were they doing that? Why would they not just raise their kids colorblind, but take the initiative to try to make me do it? The reason is that they believe that if we all adopt colorblindness and raise our kids without seeing race, we'll end racial alienation. That's a secular approach. Many people are Christian, but that's a secular approach. They're saying, we figured it out, and you need to adopt our ideals, and then we'll be able to move on. So is there an alternative to that? Well, human depravity. Humans are inherently selfish, and that cannot be taken away with education. The notion if we educate people to become more moral. I had a couple of colleagues who did some interesting paper. They looked at surveys of whites, and they found that the more education a white person had, the more likely they stated they were willing to live in an integrated neighborhood and to send their kids to an integrated school. So then they looked at data, and they looked at where whites actually lived and sent their kids. And they found among whites that the more education they had, the less likely they were to live in an integrated neighborhood, and the less likely they were to send their kids to an integrated school. And they argued education probably helped them be aware of how to protect their kids by steering them away from minority populations. Education may not make us more moral. In fact, it probably doesn't make us a more moral person. What education might do is help us to hide our immorality, because we know how the system works now. Education does not lead us to paradise necessarily. Only by accounting for our desires, for self-interest, can we find solutions for racial alienation. I would like to end all conflict by me winning. We're in conflict, you agree to me, and that's how we end the conflict. But that's not the way it works in the real world, and probably it's good that way, because if I got everything, I'd be a miserable person to be around, and you would be too. I have to, in the conflict, account for my own self-interest so that I can engage and we can find a solution that can work for us. We got to look at our desire for our self-interest, holding each other accountable. Maybe the best solution would be if God would just give all Christians the right solutions to racism instantaneously, and we go, oh, and we all agree and we work together. I would love for God to do that, but God has decided not to do that for whatever reasons. I'm not going to offer a reason why that's not the way it's done. Maybe it'd be great if God gave one person who could come and enunciate the solution, but that probably wouldn't work either. God gave me the solution and I started just enunciating it. Eventually people are going to say, well, but you're an African-American guy, so your solution is probably good for your people, but is it good for me? So what's the best thing we can do is we can come together and figure it out together. But we have to do it in a healthy way. What I call collaborative conversations, goal-oriented conversations for understanding, not just to win for the winning's sake, but for all of us to win together. To me, the implication of human depravity leads this to being a Christian approach. Next slide, please. So, a mutual accountability approach argues a Christian-based approach whereby we recognize that people of all races have a sin nature that has to be accounted for. Thus, everyone has to work towards healthy interracial communications to solve racial problems. And that means everybody. So let me be clear about something. Our solutions do not necessarily mean that everyone has the same responsibility. We may find solutions where whites do this and people of color do this. And the solutions may be that whites do more than people of color because we have this history of racial abuse. But the conversation, everyone's responsible for a healthy conversation. Everyone is. Because unless people of color somehow got past the sin nature thing, we have to check ourselves into the conversations as well. And everything gets on the table. Colorblindness gets on the table, people want it. That's the way they feel the solution is. and we discuss it out, and we try to figure it out in a healthy way, in a way where we respect the Godhead in all of us. The fact that God made all of us, that he gave us worth. We respect all that in everyone. And we're not allowed to denigrate people. That's the direction we have to go. And that's what we're not seeing in our society. And if we're going to keep going where one group's going to win out and the other group's going to win out, the school boards, what's happening right now, the protests in CRT, you know what happened? I'll tell you what happened. What happened was the anti-racists won the school boards. So, and this is not about whether they're doing CRT or not, they are implementing certain racial dynamics into the curriculum. Those who wanted colorblindness did not like that curriculum. So what are they doing now? They're making life miserable for the school boards. Probably going to vote some of the school boards out. And they're probably going to win. Are the anti-racists going to go away after that? No. They're going to fight back. So that's what we're going to have. Instead of a conversation where we can figure things out, we're going to fight each other until one group wins, until the other group wins, until the one group wins again, so forth and so on. If that's what you want, then that's what we got. If you want to try to break something else out, we got to look at a collaborative conversation approach. Okay, next slide, please. I subject the other approaches towards academic research. So let's look at the research here. Now, I will be honest. We need research, and I'm trying to work on doing some of this research. We need research directly on collaborative conversations on dealing with racial, on racism and racial alienation. We need that. That's not there yet. But we can look at some other research that indicates that this is a direction we can go. For example, we know that under the right conditions, interracial contact helps to alleviate bias. There's a lot of studies that have done this. They've been looking at this since the 1950s on research on interracial contact. And the argument is, what are those conditions? So there's still argument on the conditions, but there's not argument on the powerful effects interracial contact can have on alleviating bias. So we need to have contact. We can't go to our silos and polarize. We need to have contact with one another if we're going to solve things. Having a common group identity increases positive feelings. So when we have sort of this common identity, you've come to this conference because you come from the same denomination, that increases your positive feelings, right? And so if that's the case, we need to try to identify with others rather than put them over there and us over here. Not always possible to do that, but we need to start shooting for that. That's going to create more positive feelings. And don't we want to solve these things with being positive towards one another than fighting with one another? So seeking out those sort of common identities is very important. Families with a collaborative orientation have more positive interactions and relations with each other. Now, what do we mean by this? As opposed to collaborative, you could have a more competitive orientation. People in the family compete against each other all the time. My boys do that. My boys are always competing for this toy or that toy or that, but my boys do that. And, we're working with them on that. But families that have more collaborative, that they work together, they have goal-oriented orientations towards each other instead of fighting against one another. They have more positive feelings. If we think about our country as a family, right now we're competing against each other all the time rather than learn how to collaborate with one another. And then collaborative conversations in an atmosphere of mutual support creates relational compliance. It is not enough to win that political battle. If you win the political battle and 40% of the country hates you for it, they're going to work at sabotaging what you just won. They're not going to pull with you, they're going to pull against you. So you're going to be limited in what you can do, and also when they get an opportunity, when they can get a few more people on their side, they're going to overtake you, and then they're going to put their program in. But if we work together and come up with solutions that we can all feel good about to varying degrees, then we can have volitional compliance. People will choose to comply rather than being forced to comply. So that's something to consider. The session before this one, someone brought up the question of reparations. My stance has generally been against reparations because I felt reparations would not help the conversations, would not help race relations. You pay people of color money, then what whites are going to say is, okay, you got your money, now go away. Just to be honest, that's the way it's going to be. So I was like, no reparations. But then as I begin to think about this, there is a place for reparations in the conversation, and we talk about it. And if at the end of that conversation becomes a conclusion that some degree of reparations is necessary, and it's going to have been watered through the conversation, so it's not going to be, hey, I've decided the amount of money I want, you're going to pay me. If that's on the table, then all of a sudden reparations is not something that pulls people apart, but we've decided together, and you get volitional working together on it. That's a different animal altogether. I think that we have to think about that with the solutions that we want. If you can impose your solutions, it could even be the right solutions, but your imposing that solution is going to create the backlash that is going to doom your solution. Or we can think about how we can work together. We have to decide which way we want to go. Okay, next slide, please. Let's just touch on some implications of this approach. First, no one has all the right answers. Some people have more right than others, but no one has all the right answers, which means that we can get better answers by listening to each other. If we're listening to each other, trying to figure out where this person's coming from, trying to have answers that meets this person's needs, at least partially. We're not going to get all of our needs met, but at least what's really vital and what's something that we want. What do you need and what do you want? Get your needs met, and then maybe your want you can give up so you can get those needs met with someone who's going to help you to meet those needs. No one has all the right answers. We need intentional efforts at collaborative conversations. So we've been on social media, and we know what unguided conversations look like. And they're not very healthy often. Sometimes you get some good ones, but often they're not very healthy. The all caps and the yelling at each other on social media. So this is not, hey, let's go talk. This is, in the book, I talk about some principles that we want to look at on how we have these conversations. So we engage in them in a healthy way rather than in a non-productive way. The needs of everyone must be respected. Now, this does not mean that everyone's needs is going to be equally met, that there's not going to be any sacrifices, but we must hear out where other people are coming from as we move forward. And if we can meet their needs in a way that brings in everyone, then we should. We should do whatever we can to do that. Because it's when people's needs are not respected, when people are told, oh, that's nothing, and they're just given the back of the hand, those are the people who are going to come feel alienated, and they're going to sabotage your effort later on. They don't want to hear from you. And what you may be enunciating is real and painful, and you really want them to understand you, but you've given them the back of your hand. And they don't want anything to do with you. I'm not saying that's right. I'm saying that's human depravity, remember? So we've got to respect all the needs that come into the play here. Skills of active listening and productive communication. This is very important. As a scholar, when I do qualitative work, I have to engage in active listening because I'm interviewing people. I got to know where they're coming from. Whether I agree with them or not is irrelevant. My book on atheists, we interviewed 50 atheists. I did about half the interviews. I did not agree hardly ever with what they had to say. They never knew that because I engage in active listening. We got to listen to understand, not just to argue. And we got to learn how to communicate with one another. Do you know there's research out there that shows that when a person hears something that feels threatening, they shut off and they literally cannot hear you. So if you want to get through to people, you got to talk to them in ways they can hear you and not ways that you may feel good to you, but is threatening. I'll just give you a couple of examples. Sometimes what I've heard whites say, and I realize where this comes from, and it doesn't have this effect on me, because I know where it comes from, but I know it has an effect on many people of color. When I hear whites say, I do not see race, for a person of color, where that's a significant part of their identity, not the most important part if you're a Christian, but still a significant part. To hear that says, you don't see a part of who I am. And men begin to think, well, you don't want to know me, so they're shut out. That's it. They don't hear anything else you have to say. So we've got to learn how to talk to people in a way that they can hear us. Now, this happens the other way too. Sometimes the way people of color talk about ending whiteness or racism or white supremacy is a way that seems to imply, and they may even say, well, I don't mean that you're personally racist, but then they go on and say, but you're engaged in this white supremacy organization, stuff like that. Well, I know that from talking to a lot of my white friends, they hear that, they're gone. You may have great points, but they're gone. They're not going to hear you. We've got to talk to people in ways where they can hear us. Find ways to get their attention. Find out what they care about. Find out what they can't hear and find out what they can hear. And this is not tone policing. This is caring about someone else enough that you want to try to get through to them. So don't tell me, oh, you're going to tone police me. Well, you know what? We always tone police. You tell me you don't do that with your spouse? Come on now. You all would not be still married if you didn't tone police sometimes, all right? All right. No. Go back to that. All right. Yeah, I had one last one. We work towards solutions that are win-win instead of win-lose. All right. We got to value win-win solutions. If we win and the other people feel devastated, and we're able to shut them out of everything, you may say, "Yeah, it's great, feel good." That's not going to feel good 6 months from now when they're sabotaging you, because they didn't feel like they had a say, and you didn't listen to them, and you did not try to meet some of their needs. You don't have to meet all their needs, but we have to make the effort to try to meet people's needs for them to come in and be part of it. We got to take this seriously. We want win-win solutions. Win-win solutions is what's going to bring us together. It's going to bring community. Win-lose solutions is going to polarize us. And we do not have the luxury as a body of Christ to polarize any longer. Now go to the next slide. Because to become light in a dark world, we have to recognize some things. So, as I mentioned, I've done studies on anti-Christian attitudes, on anti-Christian bias. Let me tell you about who has anti-Christian attitudes. People who have anti-Christian attitudes are more likely to be white, male, wealthy, highly educated. In other words, what a sociologist would call the ultimate majority group. These are powerful people. They control media. They control our culture, so media, academia, entertainment. They don't always control the political realm, but sometimes they do. Powerful people. All right. We live in an anti-Christian world right now, an anti-Christian society. There's always been people who did not like Christians and people who didn't care. But when we have powerful people with these sort of attitudes, their norms and values, they can influence greatly. So the question is, that's a fact. That's not a question, that is a fact, all right? We have to just accept that. We don't have to like it, but we have to accept that. The question is, what do we do? I'm telling you, traditional ways of trying to reach an anti-Christian world do not work. I'm not saying we shouldn't have revivals, or we shouldn't, go out and preach the word and stuff like that. We should, but that's not going to have the same effect that it did in the Christian world. Here's something that people don't realize. The percentage of people who are strongly Christian in our society has really hardly declined at all, if at all. What's happened is people who are nominally Christian, who feel an obligation to come to our churches, no longer feel that obligation. So they're not coming here unless we offer them something that they want here. They're not coming here out of an obligation. They're not coming here because they feel that they have to in order to be accepted in America. They don't have to in an anti-Christian world. In fact, sometimes it's easier to be accepted by not being a Christian in an anti-Christian world. All right? So how are we going to reach these people who feel no obligation to come and hear us out? Showing our society a better way to deal with racial issues will get a lot of much needed positive attention. What if we can dream and the Christian church becomes known as the place to go and have honest, good racial conversations, the place to go to solve racial problems? What if we became known for that? Now, those individuals, even those who don't like Christians, they gotta go, well, what's happening there? What if we were helping other people to solve their racial problems? What if we were providing something that this world, our society badly wants, which is a way out of this racial mess? Remember that chart? 55, 60% of the people aren't in one of those two camps strongly. They want a way out. What if we would start providing that way out? What sort of witness would that start being? In an anti-Christian world, we need our church to be a community, and we need our community to be a multiracial community where we work our problems out rather than be at each other's throats. And we have the luxury, and we're still going to have some black churches and some predominantly white churches and ethnic churches. I'm not saying we need to get rid of all those. No. But we have the luxury of really not focusing in a lot on taking care of people, churches of other racial groups. I don't think we're going to have that luxury much longer. We got to pull together, build a community. And we got to show the world that we have answers that they desperately want. Working at modeling healthy racial conversations is a crucial way the church can thrive in an anti-Christian society. Not just survive, but thrive. So for me, this question is not it's a nice to have, solving problems of racism or being very proactive in doing something. To me, it's not a nice to have. Soon, it's going to be a must have for the church at large. And churches have different responsibilities. Some churches are in, if you're a church in a highly white community, there's only so much you may be able to do, or you're a church deep in the city, maybe there's only so much things you can do, maybe you're struggling in other ways. I'm not saying every church has to be, devote 50% of their time to doing this or something like that. I'm not saying that, but it's going to be something we're going to have to start working on. We want to get there now. We're going to start working on it now so we can get there 5 years from now when we're even more anti-Christian in our society, because that's where the trend is going, whether we like it or not. When we look at the data of younger people and such. So this is what we want to do. We got to do our part. You all are here as pastors and leaders, and you come from unique situations. You got to figure out what you want to do with it. I'm a researcher. I've started a program at Baylor, and if you want to learn how you make a partner with me, I'd be happy to talk to you about that. I'm a researcher, and I want to do the research to help support the Christian churches. Will I work with non-Christians? Yes, I will. Because this is a principle that can benefit everyone, just like the principle of forgiveness, really emerged a lot from Christians, and we know now from research that people who forgive are healthier people. So yes, we do want to work with non-Christians, but we in the church have got to start getting it down first and figuring it out. And I'll do my role as I can as a researcher. But we got to work on this together. This is a direction that we have to start to seriously consider as we go.